In Clash Royale, there are a lot of skeleton-related cards. They're your standard throwaway unit that usually won't do much on their own, but can be very threatening as a group. In 2016, you already had the Skeleton, Skeleton Army, Witch, and Tombstone, so it was a bit of a surprise to see that we would get another skeleton-based card. Graveyard would be a 5 elixir spell added in October 2016, which would essentially spawn skeletons. Why did we need yet another skeleton spawner? We already had 2. Well, the other skeleton spawners were a troop and a building, and Graveyard would be a spell, meaning it had some unique attributes, like being able to be placed anywhere in the arena. It was 5 elixir, putting it on the pricier side, and it was legendary, meaning Supercell saw this as a very special card. It may just be another skeleton spawner at its core, but in reality, it introduced a whole new playstyle with a fresh new mechanic. So fresh in fact, that it actually broke one of the established norms of Clash Royale. This card is somehow simultaneously considered one of the higher skill cards to play, while also being luck-based. There is a lot to go over, so today we're going to go over the entire history of the Graveyard, the decks it's thrived in, all the balance changes it's received, and talk about why it's fundamentally broken. This card was released on October 28, 2016 as the second and final legendary spell. But what made this card legendary? The Goblin Barrel was already technically a spell that spawned units, so that was nothing new. Unlike the Goblin Barrel, the units it spawned were staggered, so you couldn't just wipe them all out immediately. This meant when countering a splash unit, it would be much more effective than something like a skeleton army. However, this was a big negative as well, because this meant you had to wait a while before getting the maximum benefit of the card. If you wanted some quick damage, Graveyard was certainly not the go-to. You would almost never ever want to use this card on defense. Just for some perspective, not only were you waiting for your units longer, but when comparing it to something like a skeleton army, the number of units you were getting wasn't good either. A skeleton army gave you 16 units for 3 elixir, but a graveyard gave you 17 skeletons for 5 elixir. Just one more skeleton for 2 additional elixir. It didn't seem great, but this card was never designed or meant for defense. This card was designed to be placed right on the Princess Tower so the skeletons could start whittling them down immediately. Realistically, skeletons would never survive long enough to make it all the way to the Princess Tower, so this was a huge benefit that definitely made it worth the extra 2 elixir. And you would actually want the skeletons to stagger when played like this. If all the skeletons appeared at once, the opponent could easily zap or log them away for a huge positive elixir trade. But thanks to this design, you had to be a bit more creative. The spell would last for 10 seconds and spawn skeletons every half second except for its initial 1.5 second load time. This was very little reaction time compared to anything else you had to react to. For comparison, a Hog Rider from the moment it's visible takes about 4.5 seconds to make it to the tower if placed right at the bridge, and Goblin Barrel Goblins take about 4 seconds from the moment the barrel is visible to the frame they're active. It may not have been ideal for competitive play, but it created a new element to the game which added a new layer of strategy for all involved. However, even though skeletons would start spawning quickly, it wasn't as urgent to put something down immediately since the Princess Tower could deal with a good bit of it on its own. The first couple of skeletons likely wouldn't even be a threat because the Princess Tower dealt with them. The Princess Tower could take out 1 skeleton every 0.8 seconds, and a skeleton would spawn every half second from the graveyard, so it took a few seconds for it to become overwhelming. Countering this card still didn't seem too difficult though. Since the tower could deal with skeletons fairly well, putting almost any troop to assist in countering the graveyard could negate most of the damage. This is why supporting the graveyard was so important. Having something to distract the Princess Tower is what would really allow the card to get value. Or you could use spells to take out or freeze units in place. But there is another reason why Graveyard would be difficult to counter. One thing that made it fundamentally broken and why it was considered to be unhealthy for Clash Royale. It had something that no other card had, RNG. In Clash Royale, if you place the same cards at the same levels in the same places, the interaction will always have the same outcome every single time, but Graveyard was the exception to that rule. The spawn location of the skeletons was random within the radius, meaning sometimes a certain counter would negate 100% of the damage, and sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes a lot of the skeletons could spawn right on the tower, but other times they'd spawn on the far edge and have to walk over. This could easily make the difference of hundreds of damage on the tower, which is definitely notable. Now, starting hand in Clash Royale is also random, so you could argue there was already RNG built into the game, but this was different because it affected the core interactions. It was surprising to see Clash Royale add a card like this because it was shaping up to be a competitive game. They were hosting tournaments accumulating millions of views, and a lot of players were taking the game to the next level, mastering the interactions to prove their skill to the world. But now there could be an instance where a player could play the exact same way and they may win or lose even if the opponent reacts the same way, making certain matches not dependent on which player is better but which player got luckier. And if you're trying to be the best player in the world, that's an aspect you're probably not going to like. But this is partially what made the graveyard feel legendary. Every time you played it, the skeletons spawned in a unique pattern that they likely never spawned in and would likely never spawn in again. You had to take a risk as a defender, as by not defending it could mean not so much damage if the skeleton spawned far away, but practically losing a tower if the opponent got lucky. It may not have been ideal for competitive play, but it added a vastly new element to the game that would add a new layer of strategy for all involved. So with all that gone over, how was this card performing in game initially? Going about a month in, you can see Graveyard was in 7 of the top 100 ladder decks, which is below average but far from useless. It was a legendary, which was much harder to level up back then, which is important to keep in mind. Opinions on the power of the card were a bit mixed. A lot of casual players found the card to be underwhelming, but others saw a lot of promise with it. It took a good amount of effort to get value out of, and there were decent counters prominent in the meta, but the right support could make it deadly. You were seeing this card in some beatdown decks, a good bit with Golem, but you also saw it used a little bit in Giant, Hog Rider, and Miner. There wasn't really a stable trending deck with it at first, but by December, if you combine the slight variants, this deck was tied in usage with the most used deck in top ladder. Up until this point, Graveyard had pretty much only been used as a secondary win condition because it wasn't enough to take towers on its own. But this deck proved that notion to be wrong. Aside from that though, you were still seeing Graveyard a good amount in beatdown, but it was mostly used with Giant, not the other beatdown win conditions like Golem much. Graveyard was expensive, so pairing it with other expensive cards was difficult. Giant was expensive, but compared to the other beatdown win conditions, it was a steal. It gave excellent hit points per elixir, and you didn't really need the fancy abilities the other ones had. It mostly just needed a tank. The rates of the cards spiked in December, and they settled to be a little above average. Freeze was very popular with the Graveyard because it allowed the skeletons to kill defensive units or just get a lot of tower damage. Freeze lasted longer at max levels, so you saw it more in top ladder than in standard tournament play. It was really only working in these very specific decks though. As the meta changed, Graveyard had a falling out. One unfavorable change came in January thanks to a nerf to the Zap. Zap was a very popular spell commonly used with Graveyard because it was instant and could take out swarms. But in January, the damage was nerfed so it could no longer kill goblins, and this was rough for Graveyard decks because goblins were a pretty decent counter to Graveyard that granted a +3 elixir trade. Even if the skeletons could take them out with the assistance of the Zap, that was 3 extra hits that you were losing now. A lot of decks seemingly replaced Zap for Log since Log could still kill goblins, but you simply couldn't do that with Graveyard decks because Log couldn't be placed on the opponent's side, aka where the Graveyard is. It couldn't even reach where the goblins would be, and even if it could, it took a while to roll there, giving the goblins time to take out plenty of skeletons, which just wouldn't have been the case with Zap. Along with the Archers, Ice Golem, and Mega Minion nerf, Graveyard had a major fall because most people who played that card were also using these cards. But in February, the Poison was reworked to do more damage per tick, meaning it could one-shot skeletons now, but more importantly, it made it competitively viable. Now the Poison was a lingering spell that cost 4 elixir and lasted 8 seconds with 1 tick coming out each second. Graveyard had a 10-second duration, but it only spawned skeletons for 8.5 seconds of that. This would make Poison seem like the perfect hard counter. Even Freeze couldn't counter Poison. And although Poison would be decent against it, usually some skeletons would spawn in between the ticks close enough to the tower before the Poison could take them out, leading to them usually getting at least 1 or 2 hits even when the Poison was active. And considering Poison provided no offensive counter pressure, you were basically trading 1 elixir for a few skeleton hits, which isn't the worst trade. Poison actually ended up working really well with Graveyard because it created an area of denial. Since it practically lasted the entire length of when skeletons were spawning, if you knew your opponent was going to counter your Graveyard with small to medium sized units, you could take them out while getting a ton of extra free tower damage. Graveyard kept units in the same spot, and this allowed the Poison to hit units for all 8 ticks, which was hard to do since units would typically just run out of range. They were a natural synergy. It's interesting how one of Graveyard's best synergizers was also one of its best counters. Poison had pretty much fully replaced the need for zapping Graveyard decks. It was good against a lot of decent Graveyard counters and could take out much more than a Zap could. It was definitely worth the extra 2 elixir. By this point, you were pretty regularly seeing Graveyard with Baby Dragon and Bowler, and even Executioners sometimes. These were known as Splashyard decks. They were very defensive, as you had to wait for the right time to get aggressive. Baby Dragon, Bowler, and Executioner with Tornado could clean up big pushes. Once you were up Elixir, you'd go all in using one of your beefier units to tank for the yard. Pushing with the graveyard too early could lead to a massive counter push that you couldn't handle, and if you were down 1-0 as a graveyard player, you probably wouldn't have time to come back. One thing you never wanted to do while playing graveyard though is tower trade. Sometimes in Clash Royale, you and your opponent will play troops in opposite lanes, and it might be the best move for both of you to continue supporting your push in that lane. But then what happens is neither of you have Elixir for defense, leading to you taking each other's towers, and that's usually fine because it's an even trade. But tower trading as a graveyard player was a huge detriment for the graveyard player, because one tower down meant the king tower would be activated. As a graveyard user, the opponent's king tower being activated would practically be a death sentence because it took out an additional skeleton every second, which meant they could almost fully shut down a graveyard by themselves. And if you had a freeze to support and the opponent knew it, they could simply place their counter on the side and you wouldn't be able to hit it and the king tower, allowing at least one of the defenses to still be active. If a tower was down, the graveyard player might find some success in placing a graveyard, waiting just before the first skeleton spawns, then placing a giant or a bowler in the pocket to absorb both towers, but it was still harder. Being forced to support the graveyard wasn't ideal because it was such a high commitment every time. If you did knock down an opponent's tower early, you would just want to defend with your life because the second tower was much harder than the first. This led to pretty much any match where the graveyard player won, ending in a 1-0 victory. This lack of diverse viable decks and patience required to play graveyard successfully was a deterrent for a lot of people, but those who mastered it were practically undefeatable. In the top 10 most used decks for the March season, the only one that appeared was this Splashyard one, which became very iconic. It may have been the only graveyard deck, but it was by far the most used deck in top ladder, making up 13% of the finishing decks for the season. For reference, the graveyard itself had about a 16% use rate in the top 200. This isn't that much higher than average for the time. This suggested that perhaps graveyard wasn't the problem itself, rather it was carried by overpowered support cards, and once those got nerfed, graveyard would have a falling out, but that wouldn't exactly be the case. It was able to adapt with new cards like the Night Witch and even made an appearance in a P.E.K.K.A deck. In the Crown Championship in July, Graveyard also made a ton of appearances. You saw several different Cycle decks and Lava Hound with Graveyard, and Giant Skeleton with it. Almost every match had at least one player using the Graveyard. It was as popular as ever at the top level. The card may not have had an insane usage rate in top ladder, but with its consistent above average usage along with how much it was appearing in tournaments, Supercell ultimately decided that in August 2017, it was time for a nerf. 10 months after its release, Graveyard would finally receive its first balance change. In this set, its duration would be decreased by 1 second, meaning it would spawn 2 less skeletons. Looking at the rates, you can see an immediate significant drop off. Overnight, Graveyard went from being a top tier win condition to being incredibly niche. None of the most used decks for the end of the August season had a Graveyard in it. It practically vanished from the competitive scene. But was that a good thing? A lot of pro players hated Graveyard because at the end of the day, there was that element of luck built into it. It may have taken a lot of skill and patience to master, but at the end of the day, getting lucky skeleton spawns mattered when maximizing damage output. This is mostly what made it controversial. Losing a match because I made the wrong move sucks, but at least I can learn from my mistake to prevent that from happening in the future. Losing because my opponent got lucky feels devastating because all that time I spent grinding the game basically all came down to a coin flip. And we saw an example of this happening in a highly competitive match that re-sparked this conversation. In the semifinals of a Gamergy Masters tournament, a player named Jigsaw was playing Graveyard against Soaking and was losing. All Soaking needed to do was cycle one more poison on Jigsaw's tower, but first, he just needed to defend one more Graveyard.
La eliminatoria, ahí viene, cuidado porque está pegando uno por la derecha, le tira el veneno, el de la derecha se está destrozando, tiene que tirar el stock, demasiado pronto, 190, 172, 42, vamos a ver si los tickets son suficientes, le tira.
He should have been fine, but there was one cheeky skeleton that spawned right on the edge of the other side from the main chunk of the yard, which managed to get 3 hits before being taken down. These 3 hits made all the difference in allowing Jigsaw to snipe the victory. In another timeline, that skeleton did not spawn there and Soaking's poison managed to finish the tower first. This kind of mechanic was not healthy for Clash Royale competitive play, and players wanted the RNG to be removed. However, it wasn't that simple. One suggestion was to have the skeletons from the yard spawned in a fixed pattern. It would seem random, but it would always be the same so those who studied the card in depth could know exactly what they need to do, but that wouldn't work. Graveyard could be placed on the edge of the map, so chunks of it would be out of bounds, meaning skeletons would never be able to spawn there. You could even place it in the corner, so only a fourth of it was actually in bounds. Plus, skeletons couldn't spawn on top of buildings, so there would be no viable way to make them consistent unless you simply skipped skeletons that were blocked from spawning where they were supposed to. But that would be extremely frustrating and likely harder to balance. This idea would make the card needlessly more complicated and make it much more difficult and annoying for casual players to play. You have to remember, in the casual environment, Graveyard really wasn't an issue. It was mainly only a problem for a subsection of players at the very top. But Supercell does tend to cater towards the competitive side of Clash Royale, so instead of simply buffing Graveyard, they decided to give it a rework. This would come on October 9th, 2017. In an attempt to make it feel less random, the card was changed so that the skeletons would only spawn near the edge of the graveyard rather than anywhere. More specifically, it would spawn 3 tiles from the center or further. This made it less likely for skeletons to spawn right on the tower. However, its radius was also changed from 5 to 4 tiles. Usually a radius decrease would be a nerf for any card, but for Graveyard it was a buff because the skeletons would be more concentrated. You wanted them to spawn closer to the center because they would have to walk less distance to get to the tower. Its duration was also increased back to 10 seconds, and the time before the first skeleton spawned was increased by half a second, so in total the card spawned 1 more skeleton than before. It feels like this rework was ready for a while, but required a client update to implement, so they gave it that duration nerf in August so it wouldn't feel so oppressive while they waited to implement the real rework. Players weren't exactly how sure this would affect the card at the time because Supercell didn't give all the information. I said that the minimum spawn from center distance would be 3 tiles now, but Supercell didn't convey that information. They simply stated that the skeleton spawns would be less random, which can mean pretty much anything. Not only was it talking about the minimum spawn distance though, it was also including the fact that skeletons would now spawn in predetermined sectors, so you could calculate where the last few skeletons would spawn based on where the previous ones did if you were paying super close attention. The order of which they spawned was still random, but you couldn't have too many spawn in one single part of the graveyard anymore. There'd be 16 skeletons spawning from the graveyard now, so you'd have 4 spawning in each quadrant. If the graveyard was placed so part of it was out of bounds, they would simply spawn on the edge of the arena close to where they would have spawned otherwise. A lot of players didn't know what to expect. The card would be less random, but there was still RNG fundamentally built into it, so how would it fare once this went live? Graveyard saw a small bump in usage after the rework went live, but it was far from its peak. You still saw Splashyard going around, and you were also seeing some people using the cannon cart with it, as it was a tough, fast-ranged unit that tanked excellently for Graveyard. But this quickly started to fade, as in early 2018, we saw a major tank in Graveyard usage, down to the lowest it's been at yet. Throughout 2017, swarms were quite popular, which made having the tools to clean up swarms important to have, but as we head into 2018, heavier beatdown decks were more popular. Battle Ram was also much more popular in 2017, which Bowler was great against, but now you were seeing princes everywhere, and Bowler was practically useless against them. You started to see a bit more success by April as Graveyard adapted, seeing cards like Tombstone and Log being integrated to help deal with princes, guards, and goblins. Even though Log couldn't support the Graveyard directly, it assisted in a heavy defense required for succeeding in a meta like this. You also can't underestimate the power of the Ice Wizard Tornado, arguably the strongest defensive combo in the game at the moment. The following month, the Rascals were released, who were very strong. They trended with the Graveyard in this deck as they were a very efficient defensive option at the time. However, in July, we saw this Splashyard deck trending. The Ice Wiz NATO combo was still very popular, and the Inferno Dragon was also really good at this time and played a big part in the deck. This deck was very hated by players in the competitive scene. It was so defensive, and many high-level players felt that it had no counter. If mastered, it was arguably impossible to beat. It drew out matches, leading to draws, and it felt like it went against Supercell's offense over defense approach to balancing. Graveyard promoting heavy defensive gameplay as well as having RNG built into it made it the antithesis of a healthy competitive card. Inferno Dragon may have been the main cause of the backlash, but Graveyard was still the heart of these decks, and it was getting a lot of flack. Since Graveyard had an element of luck built into it, competitive players wanted it to be on the weaker side even if the luck wasn't the cause of the frustration at the moment. Once Inferno Dragon was nerfed in August, the outrage did calm down, but the core issue had not gone away. Baby Dragon got a small rework in the same month, and this was sort of the spark that made it much more popular, and it greatly benefited Splashyard. The developments weren't stopping here though. In September, the Prince was buffed, and you briefly saw some Prince Graveyard decks trending. The last major development of Graveyard came in December 2018, after a rework was given to the Freeze spell. Freeze was very popular in December, so you saw a major resurgence of Graveyard Freeze. It was interesting to see how at one point Graveyard seemed to really only be useful in a few very specific niche decks, but in 2018 it seemed to be very fluid with the decks it was appearing in, easily adapting with popular cards. Even with all the developments though, Graveyard was still appearing about an average amount in competitive play. It may have seemed broken at certain parts in the year, but in reality the Graveyard itself had been statistically balanced. There were certainly arguments for nerfing it, but in reality it had just been carried by other too strong cards. 2019 didn't have any insane developments for Graveyard, but there are some notable things to go over. The freeze was heavily nerfed, so the prominence of Graveyard freeze had dwindled down. But you were seeing Barbarian Barrel becoming a regular addition. Barbarian Barrel was similar to Log, but it spawned a Barbarian. The Barbarian Barrel let you get a Barbarian onto the opponent's side quickly, and it was a good cheap pressure option. In March 2019, the Barbarians were reworked, which made them much more prominent, and the 20-win challenge was also going on, and you saw this Graveyard deck gaining some traction as a result of all that. Besides that, you continued to mostly see Splashyard being used with Baby Dragon, Ice Wizard, and Barbarian Barrel. The card itself for the most part had a below average use rate, but a great win rate, and that was probably the best place for the card to be given its nature, but things wouldn't stay steady forever. Towards the end of the year, Elixir Golem and Night Witch would have a major rise in popularity, which subsequently led to a higher demand for splash cards. Graveyard didn't have an exceptional rise in usage, but it was able to hold its ground, and you even saw a lot of these decks incorporating the Bomb Tower, which had recently become meta. Throughout the October to December period, Graveyard's rates were slowly creeping up and ended the year having slightly above average rates. Beatdown was prevalent thanks to Elixir Golem, and Graveyard was favorable in that matchup. Even after the harsh nerfs to Elixir Golem and Night Witch in January 2020, Graveyard stayed strong. Early in the year, you saw this giant Graveyard deck growing along with Splashyard. Then in February, Barbarian Hut got a rework, making it much more prevalent, and they worked surprisingly well together. Barbarian Hut was a very strong defensive building, and that's what seemed to matter the most when it came to working well with Graveyard. Barbarian Hut with Graveyard was very popular, leading to Graveyard's individual usage skyrocketing because even with these developments, Splashyard and Giant Graveyard remained quite popular. Goblin Hut got a similar rework in April, and unsurprisingly, you saw Goblin Hut Graveyard used when that happened. You didn't see Goblin Hut Graveyard for too long because it lost a lot of its hit points in May, and although Barbarian Hut also got a hit point reduction, it was still generally good and worked decently with Graveyard through 2020. The spell was holding above average usage throughout the year, averaging more than double it had in 2019. Specific variants of Splashyard and this giant Graveyard deck consistently remained in the meta, but you saw quite a few Barb Hut Graveyard decks fluctuating in and out of the meta throughout the year. This Barb Hut Graveyard deck exploded in October though, rivaling classic Logbait and P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam's usage. Graveyard may not have had absurdly high usage, but its rates had been well above average for way too long. So, in November, Graveyard would appear in the balance changes for the first time in over 3 years. Graveyard was a weird card to balance. You couldn't really touch the stats of skeletons because they were attached to so many other cards, and changing the number of units it spawned by even just one could make a bigger difference than most people would expect. Plus, they had 4 skeletons spawned in each quadrant, so reducing that by 1 would make it uneven. The way they would nerf this card is by increasing the minimum spawn radius by half a tile, so that they couldn't spawn as close to the middle. This would make the spawns less random, since there was a smaller area that they could spawn in. Supercell explains this is to give defenders more time and to help appease the people against the RNG element of the card, while also mocking them. It had seemed like a perfect change, which is why it was a bit strange to see that it was fully reverted just 15 days later. Why would this change be reverted? Especially so soon. The card wasn't dead by any stretch, and it's not like the original change was implemented by accident. Well, this nerf actually wasn't as much of a nerf as you would think. If graveyards were placed on the center of the tower, then it absolutely would be a straight nerf, but that's never how graveyards were placed. All you had to do following this rework is make sure the graveyard was placed slightly on the inner portion of the Princess Tower, and you would actually get more cheeky skeleton spawns than before. Remember that buildings would interrupt the spawn location of a skeleton in a graveyard, which included the Princess Tower. If a skeleton tried to spawn where the Princess Tower was, it would spawn in a different quadrant. However, this would really only happen if the skeleton tried to spawn closer to 3 tiles from the center, not 3.5. So this meant you'd want the skeletons on the side of the Princess Tower to try to spawn further than 3 tiles from the center. And now this would happen more often since skeletons couldn't spawn closer than 3.5 tiles from the center. So in a way, this nerf was actually a huge buff. Many were arguing that this card was actually better than it was before, and it was intended to be a nerf. Supercell had clearly messed up. I mean, heck, there was even a Mega Knight graveyard deck briefly trending during this period. They were getting flack for this change, so that's why this was nerfed so quickly. It was nerfed originally, and now reverting the change that was considered a nerf was also considered a nerf. But that left another problem. With Graveyard back at its pre-November 2020 state, it was still going to be in need of a nerf. That's why they nerfed it in the first place. It was too strong before. Even at the end of November, there was a Mortar graveyard deck trending. Graveyard working with a siege building seemed ridiculous. Supercell was definitely going to need to take another crack at Graveyard. The original change idea was a flop, and I already discussed why it was hard to give Graveyard changes. Supercell put their greatest minds to work to give Graveyard yet another change in December. This time, they were increasing its initial spawn time by 0.2 of a second. Not only would this give a little more time for the defender to get their defenses down, but it meant one less skeleton in total spawning from the yard. Graveyard had been the most used win condition for a while now, and although just one unit is a lot, it was argued to need a hefty nerf. This wasn't the only change that would hurt Graveyard though. Barbarian Hut was also given a major nerf, so you didn't see Barb Hut Graveyard anymore, and that had been very popular since the rework it had gotten back in February. Following this change, its usage took a major fall, but they were about average now, so everything seemed to be okay, at least for now. 2021 also wouldn't be a super eventful year for Graveyard, but there are still some notable things to go over. Going into the year, things seemed to be steady. You were still seeing Splashyard and even some Graveyard double prints. But things would take a downward turn after the March balance changes. The Mother Witch, a relatively new card, would be buffed into the meta for the first time, and this card was bad news for Graveyard. Each unit she destroyed would turn into a cursed hog to fight for her side, so swarms were very weak against her. If you weren't careful, she could summon an army of hogs. She was naturally a very strong counter to Graveyard, almost being able to fully counter it with the assistance of the tower for a positive elixir trade and turn it into a huge counterattack. She was fragile enough to be taken out with a poison, but not before she turned a good amount of skeletons into enemy rushers. With her in the arena, you had to be very careful as a Graveyard player to not give the enemy too many hogs. Now, the skeletons did spawn a lot faster than the Mother Witch's attack, but even if you had something tanking for the yard, cursed hogs could tank skeleton hits while the Mother Witch was dealing with them. Just a few months later, the Goblin Drill was released, which brought a lot of splash cards such as Valkyrie and Dark Prince up. With not only Mother Witch still prominent, but with other hard counters like Valkyrie so present, it was really tough to get value with Graveyard, which is why it dropped to having just a 4% use rate in challenges in June. The decks you did see Graveyard in were really unlike the ones you had always seen. Most notably, you saw Fireball instead of Poison being used with it now. They didn't synergize well, but you just had to have it for the Mother Witch. Despite everything being against it though, it was working in these decks, and with Mother Witch getting nerfed in September, Graveyard's rates were back up to a healthier range, and you saw more traditional Splashyard being used again. Graveyard managed to end off the year having an average use rate with a well above average win rate. Graveyard's win rate had been consistently good for the entirety of 2021, and with it peaking at nearly 60%, it was looking like it would potentially need a nerf. Supercell has stated a healthy win rate should be between 45 and 55%. When talking about the Royal Ghost in the past, Supercell claimed that because it had nearly a 60% win rate, they had to be harsh in nerfing it. But because it was more complicated to play, it wasn't overused despite being very strong in a vacuum. Things would get more intense in the first few months of 2022. Giant would get a buff in February, and the Dark Prince got a rework, so you saw the rise of Giant Graveyard again. You were also starting to see a lot of Skeleton King with it. Skeleton King was similar to Graveyard, basically being a walking version of it. But the number of skeletons it summoned with its ability depended on how many units died in the arena when it was alive. So one way to play this deck was to have the Skeleton King tank for the Graveyard, and the opponent would be forced to kill those skeletons, and once they took them out, the Skeleton King would be charged, which would allow for another wave of skeletons to come in for just 2 elixir. That was strong because you were getting more skeletons that spawned quicker for less elixir. Thanks to the Skeleton King, buff to Giant, and nerfs to Mother Witch, Graveyard was undoubtedly strong again. It was appearing in a ton of different decks. The meta was practically revolving around it. Thanks to all these developments, Supercell would decide to nerf it once again. On April 4th, 2022, Graveyard would appear in the balance changes once again. This time, the duration of the spell would be changed from 10 to 9.5 seconds, leading to one less skeleton being spawned. Or as Supercell put it, they removed Barry. Also, one other thing I noticed that was a bit weird to me is that they referred to Graveyard as his instead of it, like with other spells, so I guess canonically Graveyard is male. This wasn't as bad as the previous nerf because it didn't make the first skeleton spawn later, it just affected the last skeleton, which likely would have been countered by whatever was there to counter them anyway. But at the end of the day, losing a unit is only gonna hurt. Following the changes, Graveyard's rates fell to be about average once again. It just seemed like every once in a while, it needed another haircut. It was a very adaptable card, and as new cards were added and the meta adjusted, it was able to slither its way to the top again. For a couple months after this, you went back to only seeing Splashyard, but this also included a variant with the Skeleton King. You were also seeing a giant skeleton graveyard deck rising in popularity, as it had been recently buffed. It was a very strange deck to see considering it had Fireball instead of Poison, and was generally expensive. 2022 had been a fairly tame year for Graveyard, but that was about to change come October. In October 2022, they released the Monk and Phoenix cards, which were very strong and influential upon their release. And they just so happened to work very well with Graveyard. Within just a few days of those cards released, it was being seen in more than a quarter of Grand Challenge decks, being seen almost exclusively with the Phoenix and also a good chunk with the Monk. This was just another situation of Graveyard's adaptability coming in clutch, and it showed that the card still had a crazy amount of potential. Obviously this would go down as the overpowered cards were nerfed, but with this kind of performance now, it showed that the card would likely continue to creep into the meta if it wasn't given any more changes. By December, things had pretty much cooled down with Graveyard for now, and it had very average rates. After the Phoenix Monk era, Graveyard had a pretty chill few months. It maintained an average use and win rate going into 2023, appearing in a few decks here and there with the Phoenix. That bird was really helping the card see play in fresh new decks. The one I really want to highlight though is this one that rose in April and May of 2023 with the Goblin Hut. With recent buffs to the Rascals and Spear Goblins, these cards were rising in popularity, and this deck with the Skeleton King Graveyard combo exploded in popularity. At one point in May, it made up nearly 4% of decks played in the entire game. You saw a noticeable spike in usage during this period thanks to this deck. So, in the June balance changes, 3 cards in the deck were nerfed and the deck died out. In August, the Evolved Knight was released, so you saw that used a lot with Graveyard, but it didn't really lead to an uptick in Graveyard's usage. It was more of a necessary adaptation to the meta. Besides a small downtick in November thanks to the Goblin Giant Little Prince meta, it was a pretty stable year. You did see it appearing with the Little Prince in a few decks, but overall the environment wasn't the best for it. All in all though, things stabilized, and Graveyard was back to having almost a perfectly average performance by the end of 2023. Now, going into 2024, Graveyard still wasn't having an insane performance, but the way it was being played was considered toxic by many players. The Little Prince was very often played in it now, and he was a champion, and all champions allowed for a 3-card cycle because only one of them can be on the map at once. Champions had been in the game for years, but what made Little Prince so special is that it was only 3 elixir, so it allowed for a very cheap 3-card cycle. What this led to is a playstyle where Graveyard players would place the Little Prince and cycle lots of poisons on the tower. Graveyard was very prominent at the top, and it was incredibly annoying with the new cards and evolutions. And if you were playing the new Cannoneer Tower Troop, it was even tougher to beat Graveyard since it took out the skeleton so much slower than the standard Princess. And about 30% of top players were using this Tower Troop, so it was a prominent part of the meta. The Graveyard decks being played around this time were so oppressive and uncounterable that many top players were demanding the spell to be nerfed again. But despite these developments, Graveyard's rates were still right about average. Individually, it didn't seem to be broken, but in certain scenarios, the decks were unbeatable. In the top 100 finishing deck list for February, Graveyard was used in 14 of them, which was above average. Statistically, it wasn't ridiculous, which is why in the March balance changes, Graveyard wasn't included originally. But the demand from the community was so high that Supercell added it in last minute. So in March 2024, Graveyard's duration was decreased by another half second, leading to one less skeleton being summoned by it. It really seemed like the main problem was cards like Little Prince, Evolved Knight, or Poison, but Graveyard was adaptable and the meta had been developing so much, so I can see how many thought it was time for another haircut. Following these changes, the rates seemed to still be fine, but overall they were dwindling. Giant was really surging in the meta around this time, so you were mostly seeing Graveyard paired with him, and in March you saw it paired a lot with the new Evolved Zap instead of Poison, since it dealt the damage of a big spell for just 2 elixir. The Dagger Duchess Tower Troop was ruling the meta starting in April, so using a Giant with Graveyard became more important, but you also saw a Mortar deck gain a significant amount of popularity during this era as well. For a few months, it was slumping in usage while maintaining an okay win rate, but by the end of May, it was doing really well. Things would get pretty bad in June, however. With 3 new cards being added on June 17th, the meta was in disarray once again, but unlike with the Phoenix and Little Prince eras, Graveyard wasn't able to adapt so nicely this time. Graveyard didn't work whatsoever in this environment, which led to its use and win rate drop to the lowest they've ever been. This was just a brief drop-off as there would be emergency changes, but we had never seen Graveyard fall off this hard before. Part of this could be because the Goblin Machine was a main source of tower damage unlike the Little Prince and Phoenix, but it's still worth noting. We did see a bounce back following the nerfs to the new broken cards, but its usage remained below average. The second half of 2024 was pretty dry, and in November around when the Goblinstein was introduced, you see it paired with Graveyard, but the overall popularity of Graveyard was still dangerously low. By the end of the year, its use and win rate were below average, and the future was looking uncertain. And that finally brings us to 2025. Evolved Cannon was buffed in January, and following this, you saw it included a lot with Graveyard. It was a generally strong defensive building that covered a lot of ground, so it was a natural fit. For the first few months of the year, you were basically seeing it in control decks with the Evolved Cannon and Goblin Cage still with below average but slightly better usage than it's had from towards the end of 2024. Starting in May though, we started to see some interesting developments. First, we saw the Evolution Witch, which actually gave skeletons a brand new ability, which was being able to heal the Evolved Witch by dying. Not just the skeletons that she spawned, but any skeleton. Like with the Skeleton King, this allowed for a nice synergy because you could place the Evolved Witch down and then the graveyard, and the opponent would be forced to defend the graveyard, which could give lots of healing to the Witch. Graveyard worked well with this mechanic because the Witch had a max health limit, meaning if the healing came all at once, a lot of it would be wasted. The skeletons dying periodically was the best way to utilize them. Evolved Snowball was also frequently seen with it now, as it could not only slow the tower down, but temporarily disrupt any troop from attacking and slow them down. This giant graveyard deck started popping up in May, and it got very popular, being heavily used over the next few months. The Goblin Hut also got a major rework in May, and you were starting to see that used with Graveyard again. Goblin Hut hasn't been in the meta a lot in Clash Royale history, but when it was, Graveyard was usually right there with it. You were also seeing the Goblin Curse a lot with it. The Curse, paired with other spells, could take out small to medium-sized units and turn them into supporting units, which was huge since they'd already be on the tower. Thanks to these developments, you saw a nice uptick of Graveyard's individual usage. It was very good in this environment. This was a steady period for Graveyard. It seemed like one of the strongest win conditions again. In August, Graveyard skeletons were made to no longer heal the Evolved Witch, so their synergy was gone, but there would be one more major development that would ensure Graveyard wasn't going anywhere. The Evolved Furnace. The Evolved Furnace was added on August 4th, 2025, and it made Furnace one of the most broken, influential cards in Clash Royale history. Overnight, it was all over the competitive scene, and Graveyard saw a nice bump in usage as it worked very well with it. This double spawner Graveyard deck was very popular when the Evolved Furnace was released. Furnace was nerfed just a few days later, but Evolved Furnace was still popular, and you've been seeing it in more double spawner cycle decks and even a variant with a giant skeleton in it. After the Evolved Furnace got a more proper nerf in September, Graveyard's rates dwindled down, but it still used a fair amount with Goblin Hut and even Evolved Witch despite not being able to heal her anymore. And that pretty much brings us to today. Graveyard, despite all the nerfs, is still considered to be one of the strongest win conditions in Clash Royale. It's surprisingly adaptable, and some are even still arguing for yet another nerf to this day. It's been over a year, so who knows, it will probably need another haircut eventually. I do wonder if they'll decrease the duration again though. Certainly there has to be a limit. I don't think 5 elixir for 2 skeletons will ever be viable. I do kind of miss the place Graveyard used to be in though. The original Splashyard was respectable and took a lot of effort and patience to play correctly, but nowadays the decks you see it in are very different. Never thought I'd see a double spawner giant skeleton deck reach the top deck list, but I suppose as the meta develops for years and years, every card's gotta see some spotlight with it eventually. Since the Barbarian Hut is poised for a rework in the coming months, I'm sure we'll see some more developments with Graveyard there since they were a very popular combo back in 2020. And also with the inevitable Graveyard evolution, God knows what they're gonna do with the card and how that will affect things. But for now, that's the entire history of Graveyard. I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on this one. Do you think it needs a nerf, or is it fine as is? Also let me know which card's history you would like to see next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.